You were taught to believe that your greatest danger comes from enemies outside of you, the tyrant boss, the manipulative partner, the collapsing world. But Jung discovered something far more unsettling. The real danger is within, not because you are evil, but because you unknowingly walk into psychological environments that poison you. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That wasn't metaphor, it was warning. He saw again and again that most suffering wasn't caused by accidents of life, but by invisible traps in the psyche. 7 such traps, 7 places, as he called them, that quietly dismantle the human spirit. This wasn't philosophy, this was survival. Jung documented patients who seemed outwardly stable, yet were internally eroding, men and women who lost themselves not through catastrophe but through the slow corrosion of unconscious patterns. They didn't see the trap until it had already consumed years of their life. And here is the paradox that should haunt you. What destroys the mind is not chaos, but comfort, the safe room that becomes a prison, the silence that rots into emptiness, the mask that eventually replaces the face. Jung found that the psyche doesn't collapse under pressure alone. It collapses under repetition, the daily surrender to patterns you mistake for normal. They see themselves as informed, but their minds are in echo chambers. They sense they are strong, but comparison has already stolen their worth. They feel they are authentic, but they live only as performers. Jung knew the cost. He treated patients whose sanity hung by a thread because they could not tell where the real world ended and the psychological trap began. He called it collective possession, when you stop thinking for yourself and let an environment dictate your reality. And so, I ask you, what place are you inhabiting right now without knowing it? What hidden chamber of the psyche is quietly shaping your thoughts, your relationships, your sense of self? Because if Jung was right, the most dangerous journey you take isn't across oceans or battlefields. It's the one you take without moving, inside the rooms of your own mind. Carl Jung did not stumble upon these places by theory. He found them in the wreckage of human lives. In Zurich, in his clinic, he watched respectable men unravel without clear cause and gentle women descend into despair that no external event could explain. They hadn't been ruined by war, famine, or loss. They had been ruined by invisible landscapes inside their own minds. He called these landscapes psychological places, not literal rooms, but psychic environments, subtle atmospheres of thought, emotion, and perception that a person unknowingly inhabits. Jung noted that once a patient entered one of these places, they carried it everywhere like a haunting climate. Their body sat in the office. Their soul remained imprisoned. One patient insisted her colleagues were conspiring against her. Evidence was thin, but her conviction was unshakable. Jung recognized it, a mind swallowed by the place of projection. Every flaw she could not face in herself was cast onto others. And because her certainty was absolute, she recruited others into her vision, creating what Jung termed collective possession. Another came with exhaustion, not from illness, but from years of emotional servitude. She was an empath, Jung observed, drained by what he later described as energy parasites, people who unconsciously fed on her light. This was the place of consumption, a psychic chamber where compassion mutates into depletion, where your very gift becomes your prison. Jung realized these places had patterns. They were not random misfortunes. They were archetypal traps, recurring in case after case, generation after generation. And he was terrified because they did not announce themselves with warning signs. They appeared familiar, even safe, until the patient was too deep to climb out unaided. The psyche has geography, Jung wrote. There are valleys where consciousness dissolves, deserts where meaning evaporates, and fortresses where the mask becomes the face. What he meant was simple but devastating. If you don't know the map, you will confuse prison for home. And here is where his discovery matters for you, because you too inhabit one of these places, whether it is the endless room of comparison, the haunted corridor of projection, or the hollow stage of persona. You are walking through a psychological architecture right now, one that either strengthens or destroys your mind. This was Jung's great revelation. Life is not only lived in the outer world, it is also lived in these inner places. And until you recognize the coordinates, you cannot escape the trap. Jung's revelation of these psychological places began, as so many breakthroughs do, with a single patient whose suffering defied explanation. In 1961, he treated a man who, by all appearances, was healthy, a professional with a good income, a stable marriage, a respectable reputation. Yet, when he sat in Jung's study, his eyes betrayed something else. They were clouded, not by madness, but by a kind of psychic exhaustion. He spoke of nothing catastrophic, no accidents, no betrayals, no overt traumas. And yet, he confessed, "It feels as if my mind is not my own anymore." Jung probed further, and a chilling pattern emerged. This man spent his days in 7 invisible chambers, places not made of stone, but of thought. He lived inside echo chambers where every idea he heard mirrored his own, leaving no room for doubt. He wandered through comparison arenas where every achievement turned to ash beside another man's success. He performed endlessly on the stage of persona, bowing to applause he no longer believed in. The man's nights brought no relief. Silence was suffocating, so he drowned it with noise, chatter, and stimulation, what Jung later called the chaos storm. And worst of all, deep within him, a basement remained locked. The shadow basement. A room where every shame, every forbidden impulse, every unintegrated truth had been shoved into darkness. What he thought was safety was in fact possession. Jung warned, what you bury doesn't die. It grows stronger in the dark until it owns you. This patient was not insane. He was trapped. Jung compared it to standing in a perfectly ordinary room that slowly shifts around you, walls moving closer, light growing dimmer, air growing thin. A room you can't name because it looks like every other room you've entered 1,000 times. The familiarity is the danger. The man deteriorated not because of external enemies, but because of unrecognized architecture. His brain itself began to rewire under the influence of these places, recreating the same patterns even in safety. Modern neuroscience would later confirm this. Toxic environments trigger chronic cortisol, shrink the hippocampus, and engrave helplessness into the nervous system. But Jung had seen it decades earlier. And when Jung finally mapped the 7 chambers, he did not call them curiosities. He called them death traps of the psyche. He told his students, to make the unconscious conscious is to learn the geography of your own prison. This origin case became his compass. He realized that the patient's salvation did not lie in fixing a symptom, but in escaping the place itself. To escape a prison, you must first know its name. Jung's genius was not merely in diagnosing suffering, but in giving language to the invisible. Words became keys, and keys became freedom. The first word is nigredo. Borrowed from alchemy, Jung used it to describe the blackening of the soul, the stage when all former meanings disintegrate. In nigredo, your motivation dies, not because you are weak, but because your counterfeit purposes collapse. It is psychological decomposition. The old self dissolves into darkness, and the ego, terrified of its own death, calls this failure. But Jung warned, there is no birth of consciousness without pain. Nigredo is not the end. It is the compost from which new life arises. The second word is persona, the mask you wear to survive society. It is useful, even necessary. But Jung cautioned that danger begins when the mask becomes the face. When you are only doctor, only parent, only performer. When every gesture is for others and none for yourself. Persona is a room that feels safe because applause echoes inside it, but the applause is hollow. Jung called this the perfect person problem. The third word is shadow. Everything in you that has been exiled, your rage, your envy, your sexuality, but also your brilliance, your intuition, your power. Shadow is not evil, it is unlived life. When denied, it erupts as projection, accusing others of the very qualities you cannot face in yourself. Jung wrote, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort." And finally, the fourth word, transcendent function. This is the psyche's hidden genius, its capacity to hold contradictions until something new emerges. When despair and hope clash, when love and hatred tear you apart, the transcendent function births a third path, not compromise but transformation. Jung called it the alchemy of opposites, the crucible where fragments become wholeness. These four concepts are not abstractions, they are coordinates. Without them, you wander the psychological landscape blind. With them, you can begin to see that your breakdown is not chaos, but initiation, that the emptiness you feel is not a flaw, but a passage, that the collapse of the old self is not annihilation, but individuation. Because once you can name nigredo, you stop mistaking it for depression. Once you can recognize persona, you stop confusing applause for identity. Once you confront shadow, you stop living inside projections. And once you trust the transcendent function, you stop clinging to either or and begin to live in the mystery of both and. Jung's patients didn't just need therapy, they needed a map. And these words, nigredo, persona, shadow, transcendent function, were the compass points he gave them. They see through the illusions that once animated them. The promotion that used to thrill now feels like paper in the wind. The applause that once fed them echoes hollow. What others call success appears suddenly as theater. They sense time differently. Clocks still tick, but urgency evaporates. What once demanded frantic energy now lies still, stripped of its power to compel. Deadlines, achievements, comparisons, all dissolve into the same gray fog. They feel grief, not always sharp but heavy, like soil pressing down. It is the mourning of a self that is dying, the persona that carried them for years, now decomposing before their eyes. They grieve not only the wasted years, but the comfort of old lies. They notice silence becoming unbearable. Conversations that once distracted them now irritate. Noise, once numbing, now feels violent. In this silence, they encounter the haunting truth. There is no going back. They realize rest does not fix the emptiness. Vacations, distractions, new hobbies all collapse under the same weight. Because the problem is not tiredness, it is transformation. This is nigredo. Jung warned it will be mistaken for depression, laziness, or even failure. But it is not. It is the psyche withdrawing energy from counterfeit pursuits so it can prepare the ground for something real. We must let go of the life we have planned, Jung wrote, so as to accept the one that is waiting for us. And here lies the paradox. What feels like death is the beginning of individuation, the dark soil where the new self will germinate. But before you rise, you must know the exact shape of the collapse. Because nigredo does not strike everyone the same way. It has types, patterns, and recognizable faces. Jung's patients did not all fall in the same way. The nigredo revealed itself in distinct shapes, each with its own danger. He called them collapses, not breakdowns, but structured patterns the psyche follows when counterfeit fuel burns out. Let us name them so you can recognize your own. Type Y, the persona crash. This collapse happens to those who lived for the mask, the doctor who became only his profession, the parent who became only sacrifice, the influencer who became only the audience's gaze. Jung wrote of such people, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. When it becomes the whole identity, its collapse feels like death. They discover with terror that without applause or role, they do not know who they are. Type 2. The achievement stall. Here, goals lose all magnetic pull. The athlete who no longer trains. The executive who sits blank before a full calendar. For years, their nervous system was whipped forward by comparison, competition, and reward. But awakening strips the illusion bare. Suddenly, the finish line is revealed as a painted line on concrete. What once moved mountains now cannot move a finger. Jung saw this stall not as failure, but as proof that the ego's fuel tank was empty. And he warned, forcing the old goals is like trying to reanimate a corpse. Type 3. The meaning dislocation. Some collapse not in action, but in belief. Their philosophies, faiths, or ideologies, once solid, dissolve overnight. The comforting stories no longer hold. They feel suspended in limbo, like travelers stripped of a map. Jung called this the desert of meaning, where myth dissolves, but new myth has not yet emerged. Dangerous, because despair lurks here, but also fertile, because the psyche is preparing to generate a new symbol of life. Type 5. The nervous system reboot. Finally, some collapse through the body. Their sleep shatters, their appetite changes, their very rhythms feel hijacked. They cannot force themselves into routines that once worked. They call it burnout. Jung saw it differently, the body refusing to power a life that betrayed the self. He noted how often fatigue was not exhaustion of energy, but exhaustion of pretense. The organism itself withdraws from counterfeit living, demanding a recalibration. These 4 collapses overlap, intertwine, and often spiral together. The persona crash may trigger an achievement stall. The meaning dislocation often arrives with a nervous system reboot. Yet beneath their differences, one law binds them. The psyche withdraws energy from lies so that truth can take root. Because you cannot serve both mask and self. You cannot run forever on the fumes of fear and applause. When awakening comes, collapse is inevitable. And Jung insisted, it is not a failure of will. It is the will of the psyche itself, reclaiming its energy for something more real. And so we arrive at the heart of the mechanism, why this collapse is not optional, but inevitable. Collapse is not random. Jung taught that the psyche operates with ruthless logic, and if you learn to see the chain, you realize why your suffering feels inevitable. Every breakdown follows a law of cause and effect. Because awakening exposes the counterfeit why, therefore the nervous system refuses to fund it any longer. You may still try to push forward with discipline, caffeine, affirmations, or sheer grit, but nothing sticks. The body has withdrawn the loan. What once looked like laziness is in fact a strike of the soul. Because the persona loses the steering wheel, therefore drive defaults to neutral. You wake up, look at the old tasks, and feel nothing. The goals are still written on your calendar, but there is no psychic current to move toward them. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." The persona's shoe no longer fits, and the psyche will not walk in it. Because the shadow rises, therefore psychic energy is diverted to digestion. The unconscious begins to surface, resentments, forbidden desires, unlived talents. What used to be outward drive is now consumed inwardly, metabolizing years of repression. You feel tired not because you lack energy, but because your psyche is digesting a feast it has ignored for decades. Because the psyche seeks wholeness through the transcendent function, therefore any attempt to collapse tension prematurely backfires. If you try to cling to either old career or total abandonment, either religion or nihilism, the psyche rebels. It insists on holding contradiction until a third way is born. Jung warned, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all in a certain sense insoluble. They can never be solved, only outgrown." This is why the nigredo feels unbearable. Every coping mechanism fails, every shortcut backfires, every old source of fire goes cold. The psyche enforces the pause. And here lies the bitter truth. You cannot hack your way out of it. Because the collapse is not punishment, it is purification. The psyche is not against you, it is for you, violently stripping away what no longer belongs so that your life can be lived by the self, not the mask. But Jung also warned that misunderstanding this mechanism leads to disaster. Many mistake it for illness or weakness or failure, and thus they walk into dangers far more destructive than the nigredo itself. Jung never romanticized the nigredo. He saw clearly that when awakening empties your old life of fire, you stand on a knife's edge. One path leads to transformation. 3 others lead to ruin. He called them dangers, not to frighten, but to wake the sleeper who mistakes collapse for failure. Danger 1. Pathologizing the passage. Many patients, terrified by the sudden emptiness, rushed to doctors, employers, even spiritual teachers, pleading to be fixed. They were told they were depressed, lazy, or sick. They tried stimulants, overwork, or frantic goal-setting. Jung warned that this was the gravest mistake. The shadow is not a sickness, but a task, he wrote. To call it illness is to deny the psyche's design. Pathologizing the passage chains you back to the very life the self is trying to dissolve. Danger 2. Spiritual bypass. Others, cleverer in language, avoided collapse by painting over it. They adopted new masks, the enlightened one, the healer, the ascetic. But the archetype of the savior, Jung observed, can be as inflated as the narcissist. The bypassed collapse is more dangerous than the honest one because the person believes they are awake while still running from shadow. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, Jung wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. Danger. 3. Permanent drift. The third danger is subtle. Some never recover their fire. They accept paralysis as permanent. They wander in circles, mistaking aimlessness for freedom. Jung saw them as lost in the desert of meaning, too conscious to return to sleep, too fearful to birth the new self. He feared this state more than neurotic suffering, because it offered the comfort of stagnation disguised as peace. 3 dangers, 3 false refuges, illness, bypass, drift. Each one delays the work, each one prevents transformation. And yet Jung insisted that if these dangers are recognized, they can be avoided. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, he said. But only in acceptance does the nigredo become passage rather than prison. The question, then, is how to cross, how to move through collapse without pathologizing it, bypassing it, or drifting endlessly. Jung offered a sequence, not a quick fix, but a process, phases of descent, clarification, and reignition. Jung was adamant. You cannot shortcut the nigredo, but you can navigate it. He saw over and over that those who tried to flee the blackening only prolonged their suffering, while those who submitted consciously emerged with something indestructible. He named 3 great phases, not to offer comfort, but to map the alchemy of transformation. Phase A, nigredo navigation, stabilize and see. The first demand is endurance, not escape, but conscious descent. Jung told his students, no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The nigredo is those roots. Energy audit. For 72 hours, you simply notice. Where does your energy drain? Where does it return? No edits, no judgments. The map of leaks is your first scripture. Shadow dialogues. Write down what you most fear or resent about yourself. Read it aloud without commentary. You are not cursing yourself. You are meeting what was already there. Boundaried stillness. Each day, sit in deliberate unproductivity. 20 minutes of silence where you resist the urge to fix or optimize. This is rehearsal for enduring nothingness without panic. Here the deliverable is clarity, a list of counterfeit whys that once drove you, now exposed as corpses. Because until you see what died, you cannot grieve it. Phase B, albedo clarification, clean and choose. After the blackening, a whitening. Jung borrowed the alchemist's term albedo to describe the cleansing that follows dissolution. It is not rebirth yet, but purification. Value distillation. Write 10 values, then cut them to 3. If you cannot sacrifice the lesser, you will never serve the greater. Persona contract rewrite. List where the mask is still useful and where it must be banned. The mask is not the enemy. It is a tool, but a tool must never become master. Somatic yes/no. Begin testing new commitments with the body. Watch for the tightening in the gut, the warmth in the chest, the stillness behind the eyes. The body often knows the self before the ego consents. The fruit of this phase is a document Jung might have called a Y 2.0, a one-page creed not borrowed from society, but drawn from the marrow of your own experience. Phase C, rubedo reignition, act and integrate. Finally, the reddening, rubedo. Fire returns, but it is not the counterfeit blaze of ego. It is the steady flame of self. Microvows, choose one act each day that honors your why. Not grand resolutions, a vow small enough to complete in 15 minutes. Repetition matters more than drama. Transcendent rehearsal. When torn between two opposites, resist premature choice. Hold the tension until a third path shows itself. This is the transcendent function at work, the alchemy of opposites birthing something new. Relational reentry. Share your why with 2 people, one who will support, one who will resist. In both cases, notice your clarity. If your why crumbles under challenge, it was not yet rubedo. This is not triumph, but integration. Your calendar begins to reflect the self, not the mask. Your body's rhythms align with authenticity rather than anxiety. Energy flows sustainably, not in manic bursts or hollow obligations. Jung saw these 3 phases not as ideals, but as inevitabilities: blackening, whitening, reddening, collapse, purification, integration. They mirror alchemy, because alchemy itself was always a metaphor for the psyche. Because you will collapse, therefore you must descend. Because you will grieve, therefore you must clarify. Because you will be reborn, therefore you must integrate. But even with the map, most stumble. Jung warned that there are pitfalls, common derailers that wait at every stage. To know them is to protect the work. Jung never pretended the alchemical path was smooth. He saw that even those who understood nigredo, albedo, and rubedo could still sabotage themselves. The psyche has enemies not only outside but within, habits, defenses, and shortcuts that collapse the work. He cataloged the most common derailers and offered precise antidotes. Pitfall 1, waiting for motivation before moving. Patients often sat before Jung insisting, "I'll act when I feel ready." But readiness never came. Jung observed that waiting for passion is a trick of the ego. You are what you do, not what you say you'll do, he warned. The antidote is tiny action before inspiration. Move first, and the fire returns after. This is why micro-vows matter. They are sparks struck in the dark. Pitfall 2. Mistaking isolation for integration. Many withdrew from relationships, claiming they were protecting their energy. In truth, they were hiding. Jung insisted solitude is necessary, but if prolonged, it curdles into alienation. He wrote, "The individual who is not anchored in the community becomes unstable." The antidote is structured solitude balanced with honest connection. Time alone, paired with the courage to test your new self in the presence of others. Pitfall 3. Rebranding old goals with new language. This is the most seductive error. Jung noted how some patients cloaked the same ambitions in spiritual words. Career hunger became calling, control became leadership, addiction to applause became service. The persona had simply changed costumes. The antidote is congruence testing. Ask not what it sounds like, but what it feels like in the body. If it burns with anxiety, it is still ego fuel. If it glows with calm inevitability, it belongs to the self. Pitfall 4. Waiting for permission. The final derailment is subtle. the belief that validation must come from teacher, parent, partner, or society before you may act. Jung saw this as the last grip of the collective unconscious. The antidote is sovereignty practice. Grant yourself a 30-day license to live as if your authority were final, because it is. Pitfalls are not failures, they are tests. Each one asks whether you will regress to the old psyche or cross into individuation, and Jung believed that by naming them, by preparing for them, you make them lose their power. Avoid these 4 derailers, and the path clears. The question then becomes, how do you recognize success? What does true reignition look like when it arrives? Jung taught that real transformation does not announce itself with fireworks. It arrives quietly, unmistakably like dawn after a long night. His patients who crossed Rubedo described a set of markers so consistent he called them signs of the self's return. If you know these, you will not mistake counterfeit fire for true reignition. Marker 1. Calm drive. Energy returns, but not in manic bursts. You work, but without violence against yourself. There is effort, yes, but no self-betrayal. Jung called this the balance of conscious striving, when action serves the self instead of enslaving it. Marker 2. Value-aligned friction. Life does not become easy. Obstacles remain, but resistance feels meaningful rather than draining. Struggle has weight, but also dignity. You no longer burn out against what doesn't matter. You wrestle only with what aligns to your deepest truth. Marker 3. Shadow cooperation. What once haunted you now serves you. Rage becomes boundary. Envy becomes clarity of desire. Fear becomes vigilance. Jung wrote, "The gold is in the shadow." True reignition appears when disowned parts no longer sabotage you but contribute to your wholeness. Marker 4. Social recalibration. You notice your circle shifting. Shallow ties fade without drama. A few authentic connections deepen. People sense your presence differently. Some grow nervous, others grow safe. Jung observed this repeatedly. The individuated person does not need to proclaim transformation. Their being itself reorders the field around them. These markers are subtle, but undeniable. They signal that the nigredo has done its work, that the self has reclaimed its energy, that fire has returned, not borrowed from ego or applause, but generated from the depths. And Jung emphasized, these markers are not the end. They are thresholds. To understand what comes next, he often pointed to mirrors from history, cautionary figures who lost their way, and exemplars who integrated fully. Jung believed that to recognize true transformation, you must study both its failures and its fulfillments. History, he said, is littered with the wreckage of those who mistook persona for self, and illuminated by the few who endured nigredo and emerged whole. The cautionary figure. Consider Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher ablaze with vision, yet consumed by the very fire he could not integrate. He proclaimed the death of God. He thundered against mediocrity. He saw deeper than most dared. But he lacked what Jung later called the container of the self. His intensity collapsed into psychosis. Nietzsche became a warning. Brilliance without integration corrodes. Awakening without shadow work unravels. The exemplar. Now consider Viktor Frankl, a man who endured Auschwitz, stripped of possessions, family, even freedom, yet did not collapse into nihilism. Instead, he birthed logotherapy, a psychology rooted in meaning itself. Frankl embodied what Jung saw as rubedo, the return of authentic fire after total dissolution. His drive was not egoic striving, but soul-motivated purpose. He discovered, as Jung insisted, that suffering cannot be avoided, but it can be transfigured. Jung pointed to these contrasts to teach a law. Collapse alone does not transform. Some break under nigredo, inflating persona, or succumbing to madness. Others endure, clarify, integrate, and emerge luminous, dangerous in the best sense. Because the difference between cautionary and exemplar is not intelligence, nor luck, nor even circumstance. It is willingness to walk consciously through the blackening, to face shadow, to wait in emptiness without panic. Jung knew that alone makes the difference between annihilation and individuation. But the stakes extend beyond biography. Jung warned that individual journeys mirror collective ones. A culture, too, can enter nigredo, and its survival depends on whether it pathologizes, bypasses, or integrates. Jung never saw individuation as a private luxury. He warned that what happens in the psyche of one inevitably echoes in the psyche of all. The world hangs by a thin thread, he wrote, and that thread is the psyche of man. When individuals fail their nigredo, societies fail theirs. We are living through a collective blackening. Institutions that once seemed eternal, governments, churches, economies, even science itself, are dissolving in mistrust. The myths that bound us no longer hold. We scroll endlessly, yet feel emptier. We chase goals, yet find them hollow. What you feel in your private life mirrors the disorientation of entire civilizations. This is not coincidence. It is pattern. Jung believed the collective unconscious undergoes cycles just as the individual psyche does. There are eras of persona, when nations wear masks of progress and order. There are eras of shadow, when buried corruption erupts into the open. And there are eras of nigredo, when all stories collapse, leaving only the black soil of dissolution. We are in that soil now. The question is the same for you as it is for culture. Will collapse lead to transformation or drift? Will we bypass with shallow slogans, pathologize with endless distractions, or endure until a new meaning is born? Jung's answer was always sobering, but hopeful. If enough individuals integrate, the collective can follow. Conscious souls become cultural medicine. Your private work, grieving counterfeit goals, clarifying values, integrating shadow, is not self-indulgence. It is participation in history. Every person who becomes whole weakens the grip of collective possession. Every reignited life becomes a torch in the cultural nigredo. Because Jung saw it clearly, salvation never begins at the level of the system. It begins with the psyche, always. We began with the terror. That awakening kills your motivation, that the very light of consciousness extinguishes the fire of your life. But now you see what Jung saw. The danger was never that you lost your drive. The danger was believing that the corpse of your old drive was the corpse of you. It wasn't laziness, it was lucidity, it wasn't depression, it was dissolution, it wasn't the end. It was the blackening before rebirth. Jung reframed it with ruthless clarity. The psyche withdraws energy from counterfeit pursuits so that the self may live. What feels like death is the composting of illusions. What feels like emptiness is the womb of the authentic life to come. And so, the paradox resolves. Your lost motivation is not evidence of failure, but proof of progress. You are no longer animated by the borrowed why of persona, fear, or society. You are waiting, in the dark, in the silence, for a fire that belongs to you alone. Jung's final word was not despair, but inevitability. You must lose yourself completely before you can find yourself authentically. And when you understand this, the nigredo ceases to be prison, it becomes initiation. Jung never ended with despair. He ended with process. Because knowing the map means little if you do not take the first step. To cross nigredo consciously, you need practice, not theory. So let me give you what Jung gave his patients, a ritual of days. The 7-day starter protocol. Day 1 to 2, energy audit. Write down everything that drains you and everything that feeds you. Do not explain, do not justify, simply record. Day 3-4, value distillation. From 10 values, cut to 3. Cross out the borrowed, the inherited, the performative. Keep only what makes your chest expand. Day 5, 1 micro vow. Choose a 15-minute action aligned with those values. Complete it without fanfare. Small fire is real fire. Day 6. Relational Re-entry. Share your vow with one person who believes in you and one who doubts you. Stand steady in both mirrors. Day 7. Review for calm drive. Ask, did this action feel like strain or like inevitability? The answer reveals whether it was ego-driven or self-born. This is not the full journey, but it is the first descent with a lantern in your hand. Now hear the deeper truth. The danger isn't that you see too much or feel too much or awaken too soon. The danger is failing to build a conscious relationship with that seeing, that feeling, that awakening. Because if you bypass, you remain a mask. If you pathologize, you return to chains. If you drift, you lose decades. But if you endure, clarify, integrate, you become part of what Jung called the individuation of humanity itself. Your private transformation becomes cultural medicine. So I leave you with this commissioning. Identify your collapse type. Name your phase, nigredo, albedo, or rubedo. Share your micro-vow, not for applause, but for accountability. Write it, speak it, live it. Because the danger is not that you lost your fire. The danger is that you settle for counterfeit flames. Let the old fire die. Let the nigredo blacken. Then light the match of the self. Use it as medicine and become part of what's next.